You ever notice how some people walk away from a good thing and only realize what they lost when it's too late? I'm not talking about a burnt dinner or a missed phone call. I'm talking about a marriage, a real one, the kind built over decades through mortgages, hospital waiting rooms, long nights raising kids, and quiet mornings drinking coffee at the same kitchen table. Now imagine throwing all of that away for someone new, someone exciting, someone who makes you feel 25 again. Sounds like a dream to some people, but sometimes that dream turns into a nightmare nobody saw coming. And that's exactly what happened to Marcus Langford. For 32 years, Marcus had been married to the same woman, Elaine. Elaine wasn't flashy. She didn't wear designer dresses or post selfies online. But she was steady, the kind of woman who packed Marcus's lunch every morning even after the kids moved out. The kind who remembered everyone's birthday, including Marcus's mother, who honestly didn't even remember her own half the time. But somewhere along the way, Marcus started feeling something he couldn't quite explain. Restless, like life had gotten predictable. Now let me ask you something real quick. Have you ever noticed how people sometimes confuse peace with boredom? Because that's where Marcus made his first mistake. He started believing his quiet life was something he needed to escape. And that's when Vanessa walked into his world. Vanessa worked at a marketing firm Marcus had recently partnered with for his real estate business. She was younger, sharp, confident, the kind of woman who made every room feel like a stage. And Marcus? Well, Marcus felt seen. Vanessa laughed at his jokes, listened when he talked about business, looked at him like he was the most interesting man in the room. Now, if you've lived long enough, you already know where the story is headed. But Marcus didn't, because when temptation shows up, it rarely introduces itself as trouble. It shows up dressed like opportunity. And before Marcus even realized what was happening, lunch meetings turned into long dinners, phone calls turned into late-night conversations, and the quiet life he once called home started to feel like a cage. Then one evening, Marcus sat across from Elaine at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared thousands of meals, and he said 6 words that would change everything. I think I want something different. Now let me pause right there for a moment, because if you've ever been on the receiving end of words like that, you know how cold they feel. Elaine didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't throw dishes like you see in those TV dramas. She just sat there, staring at the man she had spent more than half her life with. Then she quietly asked one question. Is there someone else? Marcus hesitated, and sometimes silence tells you everything you need to know. 3 months later, Marcus moved out and Vanessa moved in. But what Marcus didn't know was that the life he thought he was running toward was about to disappear, literally, because just 6 months after Marcus left his wife, Vanessa vanished. No goodbye, no explanation, no trace. And the truth behind what happened would force Marcus to confront something he spent years trying to ignore. Something about Elaine, something about himself, and something about the kind of love people don't appreciate until they destroy it. But to understand how everything fell apart, we need to go back to the moment Marcus first realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. And, strangely enough, it started with something as simple as a missing phone call. At first, Marcus didn't think much about the missed call. Vanessa had been busy before. Her work schedule was unpredictable, and she sometimes traveled for meetings. So when her phone went straight to voicemail that Tuesday afternoon, Marcus simply shrugged it off. Probably another late meeting, he muttered to himself. But by evening, something felt off. Vanessa usually called. Not once, not twice, but constantly. She liked to talk about everything. Her day, her clients, the people who annoyed her at work,
the coffee shop down the street that somehow never made her latte right. Marcus used to joke that Vanessa could turn a 5-minute story into a 30-minute podcast. And yet, that night, nothing. No calls, no texts, no sarcastic voice notes about her coworkers. Just silence. Now, if you've been around long enough, you know something about silence. Sometimes it's peaceful, sometimes it's suspicious, and sometimes it's the kind that crawls under your skin and refuses to let you sleep. Marcus tried calling again, straight to voicemail. He sent a text. "Hey, everything okay?" No response. An hour passed, then 2. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever waited for a message that never came? You keep checking your phone, even though you already know the answer. Marcus sat on the couch in the apartment he and Vanessa shared, staring at the blank screen like it owed him an explanation. By midnight, his mind started wandering to places he didn't like. Maybe her phone died? Maybe she stayed with a friend? Maybe, or maybe, she was ignoring him. That last thought bothered him more than the others, because Vanessa wasn't the quiet type. Ignoring someone didn't fit her personality. The next morning, Marcus drove to Vanessa's office. The receptionist looked up from her desk as he walked in. "Hi," Marcus said, trying to sound casual. "Is Vanessa in today?" The woman frowned slightly. "She hasn't come in." Marcus nodded slowly. "Maybe she's working from home." The receptionist shook her head. "We thought that too, but no one's heard from her since yesterday." Now, Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. "Since yesterday morning?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "She left around lunch. Did she say where she was going?" The receptionist shrugged. "No idea." Marcus walked back to his car, trying to convince himself this wasn't a big deal. People disappear for a day all the time, right? But as he pulled into the parking lot of their apartment building, a strange feeling crept in. Vanessa's car was still there, parked in the same spot, untouched. Now, that didn't make sense. If she left work yesterday, how did she get home? Marcus stepped out of his car and approached Vanessa's vehicle. The doors were locked. Her purse wasn't inside. Neither was her phone. Just an empty passenger seat and a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder. Marcus suddenly realized something. Vanessa hadn't packed a bag, hadn't taken her laptop, hadn't even taken the jacket she always carried. It was like she had stepped out of her life for 5 minutes and never came back. That's when Marcus felt the first real wave of panic, because this wasn't just someone ignoring a phone call. This was something else, something bigger. And for the first time since leaving Elaine, Marcus felt a deep, unsettling thought creep into his mind. What if Vanessa didn't leave him? What if something happened to her? But Marcus wasn't ready for the truth yet, because the moment he decided to report Vanessa missing, he would discover something strange, something the police noticed immediately. Something about Vanessa's last known location, a location that made absolutely no sense. Because according to her phone records, the last place Vanessa's phone had been active was only 3 blocks away. 3 blocks away from the house Marcus once shared with his wife, Elaine. And suddenly, a story Marcus thought was over was just beginning again. When the police officer said the address out loud, Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. 3 blocks from Maple Street. Maple Street? That was where Elaine still lived. The same quiet neighborhood Marcus had called home for over 30 years. Tree-lined sidewalks, the corner grocery store where everyone knew your name, the park where Marcus used to push his kids on the swings when they were small. And now, somehow, Vanessa's phone had last been active there. Marcus cleared his throat. "That doesn't make sense," he said quickly. The officer looked up from his notes. Why not? Marcus hesitated, because explaining it meant admitting something uncomfortable. My ex-wife lives there. The officer paused for a moment. Not suspicious, just thoughtful. Did Vanessa know that? Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, I mentioned it once. Once. That's what Marcus told the officer, but the truth was a little more complicated than that. Vanessa had asked about Elaine more than once. Not in a jealous way, more like curiosity. What was she like? Did you two still talk? Do you ever miss that life? At the time, Marcus brushed those questions off. He assumed Vanessa was just making conversation. But now, sitting in that police station, those questions felt different. The officer tapped his pen lightly on the desk. We'll check the area, he said. It could be nothing. Could be nothing. Those words are comforting until they're not. Marcus drove toward Maple Street that afternoon, and something strange happened as he turned onto the familiar road. Memories started showing up like uninvited guests. There was the mailbox Elaine had insisted on painting blue. There was the little bakery where she used to buy cinnamon rolls every Sunday morning. Marcus hadn't realized how much of his life was still sitting there, waiting quietly. It had been almost a year since he left, but the neighborhood looked exactly the same. Meanwhile, his own life? Well, that had become something else entirely. As Marcus slowed down near the corner, he noticed a police cruiser already parked along the street. An officer was walking up the sidewalk toward Elaine's house. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Wait, what? He pulled his car over quickly. The officer knocked on Elaine's door. Marcus watched from across the street, unsure whether to get out of the car or drive away. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever avoided a place because it reminded you of the person you hurt? Because Marcus hadn't stepped foot near that house since the day he left. And now, here he was, sitting across from it like a stranger. The front door opened. Elaine stepped outside. She looked exactly the same. Same calm posture, same soft expression, same quiet strength that Marcus once mistook for weakness. The officer spoke to her for a moment. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see Elaine's reaction. Confusion, then concern. Then she glanced down the street, directly toward Marcus's car. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time felt strange. Marcus hadn't spoken to her in months, not since signing the final divorce papers. But the look on her face wasn't anger, it wasn't bitterness, it was something else, something Marcus couldn't quite read. Elaine said something to the officer and pointed toward Marcus. The officer turned. Now both of them were looking directly at him. Marcus sighed and stepped out of the car. Somehow, this situation had pulled him right back into the life he thought he had escaped. The officer approached first. Mr. Langford? Marcus nodded. Yes. We're asking neighbors if anyone saw Vanessa yesterday afternoon. Marcus glanced at Elaine briefly before answering. I don't think she came here. Elaine spoke quietly. I've never met her. That sentence hung in the air. Simple, honest, but uncomfortable. Because even though Elaine had never met Vanessa, Vanessa had clearly been very interested in Elaine's neighborhood. And that raised a question nobody in that moment could answer. Why would Vanessa come here? But what Marcus didn't know was that someone else on that street had already seen Vanessa, someone who remembered exactly what time she arrived, exactly where she parked, and exactly who she spoke to. And when that neighbor finally shared what they saw, the entire story would take a turn Marcus never expected. Because Vanessa hadn't come to Maple Street by accident, she came looking for someone. And it wasn't Marcus. It was Elaine. When the neighbor finally spoke up, the entire street seemed to go quiet. Her name was Mrs. Dolores Whitaker. Now, every neighborhood has one. You know the type. The unofficial mayor of the block, the woman who waters her flowers at the exact same time every afternoon and somehow notices everything that happens within a three-house radius. And Mrs. Whitaker noticed Vanessa. "Oh, yes," she said, leaning on her front gate. "I remember her clearly." The police officer stepped closer. "When was this?" Mrs. Whitaker thought for a moment. "Yesterday, around 2 in the afternoon." Marcus felt a cold ripple run through his chest. 2 o'clock. That was exactly when Vanessa had left her office. The officer nodded. "And what did you see?" Mrs. Whitaker pointed down the street. She parked right there, silver sedan. Marcus immediately recognized the spot. It was directly across from Elaine's house. The officer scribbled something in his notebook. "Did she go inside the house?" Mrs. Whitaker shook her head. "No." Now that caught everyone's attention. Elaine looked confused. Marcus felt even worse, because if Vanessa didn't go inside, then why had she come? Mrs. Whitaker continued. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. Elaine spoke softly. "I wasn't home yesterday afternoon. I was at the grocery store." Mrs. Whitaker nodded. "That must be why." The officer looked up. "What happened next?" Mrs. Whitaker hesitated slightly, like she was replaying the moment in her mind. "Well, she waited on the porch for a minute. Then she walked back to her car." Marcus held his breath. "And then?" the officer asked. Mrs. Whitaker tilted her head slightly. "That's the strange part." Now, if you're listening closely, you already know when someone says, "That's the strange part," the story is about to get interesting. Mrs. Whitaker pointed farther down the street. "She didn't leave." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "She just sat there in the car." "For how long?" the officer asked. "Oh, maybe 15 minutes." Marcus tried to imagine Vanessa sitting quietly for 15 minutes. That alone sounded unusual. Vanessa hated waiting. She once complained for 10 minutes about a slow elevator, but 15 minutes in silence? Something about that didn't fit. Mrs. Whitaker continued. Then someone else walked up to the car. Marcus felt his pulse jump. "Someone else?" the officer repeated. "Yes." "Did you recognize them?" Mrs. Whitaker paused again. Now her expression changed slightly. Not confused. Concerned. "Well, that's the thing." The officer waited patiently. "I couldn't see the person clearly at first," she said. "They came from behind the trees near the sidewalk." Marcus suddenly felt uneasy. "Did they get in the car?" the officer asked. Mrs. Whitaker nodded slowly. "Yes." Elaine looked surprised. Marcus looked completely lost. "And then?" the officer asked. Mrs. Whitaker pointed toward the end of the street. "They drove away together." Marcus blinked. "That's impossible." The officer turned toward him. "Why?" Marcus swallowed. "Because Vanessa's car is still in our apartment parking lot." Now it was the officer's turn to look confused. Mrs. Whitaker raised her eyebrows. "Well, the woman I saw definitely drove away." The officer asked the obvious question. "Are you sure it was Vanessa?" Mrs. Whitaker nodded confidently. "Oh, yes, I remember her face." Then she said something that made Marcus's stomach drop. She looked nervous. Now, let me pause here for a second, because when someone shows up unannounced, waits outside your ex-wife's house, and then drives away with a stranger looking nervous, that's not a coincidence. That's a story. But the part that really unsettled Marcus came next. The officer flipped to a new page in his notebook. "Mrs. Whitaker, can you describe the person who got into the car?" She squinted slightly, thinking carefully. "Well, they were wearing a dark jacket." "Anything else?" She hesitated again. Then she said something nobody expected. I think, everyone leaned closer, I think it was a man. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly, because Vanessa hadn't mentioned meeting any man that day. And if Vanessa had left Maple Street with someone else, then the biggest question was no longer where Vanessa went. The question had suddenly become, who was the man she left with? But what Marcus didn't realize yet was that the answer to that question was already sitting inside Elaine's house. And within the next hour, Marcus would discover something that made this entire situation even more disturbing. Because Vanessa hadn't just come to Maple Street looking for Elaine. She had come looking for the truth about Marcus. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, staring at Elaine's house like it suddenly held answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The police officer closed his notebook. "Mrs. Whitaker, thank you. That helps." The older woman nodded proudly, clearly satisfied that her afternoon of watering roses had turned into useful detective work. Now the officer turned toward Marcus and Elaine. "I'd like to ask both of you a few questions inside, if that's okay." Elaine stepped aside and opened the front door. "Of course." Marcus hesitated. It had been nearly a year since he crossed that doorway. Funny how a house you once lived in can suddenly feel like someone else's territory. But eventually he followed them inside. And just like the street outside, almost nothing had changed. The same cream-colored couch, the same framed family photos on the wall, the same old clock ticking slowly above the fireplace. Tick, tick, tick. Marcus used to complain about that clock, said it was too loud. But standing there now, it almost felt comforting. The officers sat at the dining table. Elaine and Marcus sat across from each other like two people who had once known everything about one another and now barely knew where to begin. "Mrs. Langford," the officer said gently, "had you ever spoken to Vanessa before?" Elaine shook her head. "No." "Did she ever contact you? Phone call, message, anything like that?" Elaine paused. Marcus noticed the hesitation immediately, and something inside him tightened. "Well," Elaine said slowly. The officer looked up. "Yes?" "I did receive an email last week." Marcus blinked. "What?" Elaine glanced toward him briefly. "I didn't think it was important at the time." The officer leaned forward slightly. "What did the email say?" Elaine stood up and walked toward a small desk near the window. She opened her laptop and clicked a few times. The room stayed quiet except for the soft tapping of the keyboard. Then she turned the screen toward the officer. Marcus leaned closer. The email was short, very short. It read, "Hello, Elaine. You don't know me, but my name is Vanessa. I think we should talk. There are things about Marcus that I believe you deserve to know." Marcus felt his face go pale. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked quickly. Elaine didn't answer. The officer looked at the date. "This was sent 5 days ago." Elaine nodded. "Yes." "Did you reply?" "No." Marcus stared at her. "You didn't tell me about this." Elaine looked at him calmly. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." "Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard a sentence that sounds simple, but somehow carries years of quiet pain behind it?" That was one of those sentences. The officer asked the next obvious question. Did Vanessa explain what she meant? Elaine shook her head. No, that was the entire message. Marcus rubbed his temples. This doesn't make any sense. But deep down, something was starting to make uncomfortable sense. Vanessa had been asking questions about Elaine. Vanessa had shown up at this house. Vanessa had waited on the porch. And Vanessa had clearly believed Marcus was hiding something. The officer leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Langford," he said calmly, Is there anything about your past, anything at all, that Vanessa might have discovered recently? Marcus frowned. No. The officer held his gaze. You're sure? Yes. But Elaine was still watching him, and the look on her face wasn't confusion. It was recognition, like someone who had been waiting years for a certain truth to catch up with someone. Finally, she spoke quietly. Marcus. He looked at her. There is something, she said. Marcus shook his head quickly. No, there isn't. Elaine's voice stayed calm. Yes, there is. The officer looked between them. What is it? Elaine folded her hands together, and then she said 5 words that made the room suddenly feel smaller. Marcus never told you about Daniel. The officer frowned. Daniel? Marcus stood up abruptly. Elaine, stop! But Elaine didn't, because sometimes silence lasts for years, until the moment it finally breaks. And once it does, there's no putting the truth back where it came from. And the truth about Daniel was the one thing Marcus had spent his entire life trying to forget. The room went still. Not the comfortable kind of still, the kind where people are thinking. No, this was the kind of silence that makes your stomach tighten. The officer looked between them. Who is Daniel? Marcus rubbed his forehead. Elaine, this isn't necessary. But Elaine didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the officer. Daniel was Marcus's business partner, years ago. The officer nodded slowly. In real estate? Elaine shook her head. No, before that. Marcus exhaled heavily. Now, let me pause for a moment, because everybody has chapters in their life they don't like to revisit. Old mistakes, bad decisions, things we convince ourselves are buried in the past. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it waits patiently, and when it finally comes back, it brings company. Elaine continued. This was about 12 years ago, she said quietly. Marcus and Daniel started an investment company together. The officer scribbled a note. And what happened? Marcus answered quickly. The business failed, that's all. Elaine tilted her head slightly. That's not all. Marcus's jaw tightened. But the officer spoke first. Mrs. Langford, please continue. Elaine nodded. The company didn't just fail, she said. It collapsed. Marcus looked away, because he knew what was coming next. There were lawsuits, Elaine said. Investors lost money. A lot of it. The officer looked up. Was anyone charged with a crime? Marcus answered this time. No. But the way he said it sounded defensive. Elaine continued. Daniel disappeared shortly after the company shut down. The officer raised his eyebrows. Disappeared? Marcus shook his head. He moved away. Elaine looked at him calmly. Did he? Marcus didn't answer. The officer leaned forward. When was the last time you saw him? Marcus hesitated. The night everything fell apart. The officer wrote something else down. And after that? Nothing, Marcus said. No phone calls, no emails, no contact. Elaine folded her arms lightly. Not exactly. Marcus looked at her again. Elaine! But she continued anyway. There was one phone call. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. The officer looked up. When? Elaine spoke slowly. About a week after the company collapsed. What did he say? Elaine looked directly at Marcus. You remember. Marcus finally sighed. He said someone would eventually come asking questions. The officer stopped writing. Questions about what? Marcus didn't answer immediately, and that silence spoke loudly. Elaine finished the sentence for him. About the money. The officer's expression changed slightly. How much money are we talking about? Marcus swallowed. $2 million. Now, if you're listening closely, you probably just felt the weight of that number. $2 million doesn't just disappear quietly. And when money like that vanishes, people start looking for answers. The officer leaned back slowly. And you believe Vanessa discovered something about this? Marcus shook his head quickly. No, that was years ago. But Elaine wasn't convinced. Vanessa worked in marketing analytics, she said. The officer nodded. And? She specialized in financial data, Elaine explained. Now Marcus felt his chest tighten again, because suddenly Vanessa's strange questions over the past few months started making uncomfortable sense. Questions about old investments, questions about business records, questions about Marcus's former partner. Vanessa hadn't just been curious, she had been investigating. And that meant something else, too. Something Marcus hadn't considered until now. Vanessa might have discovered something about Daniel. Something important. The officer closed his notebook. Mr. Langford, do you have any idea where Daniel might be now? Marcus shook his head. No. But Elaine spoke again quietly. I do. Both men turned toward her immediately. The officer raised an eyebrow. You know where he is? Elaine nodded once. Yes. Marcus stared at her. What are you talking about? Elaine looked at him calmly. Daniel called here 3 days ago. Marcus felt his heart stop. What? The officer leaned forward again. What did he want? Elaine answered softly. He asked about Vanessa. And suddenly, the mystery of Vanessa's disappearance had become something far more complicated. Because if Daniel was back, then this wasn't just about a missing woman anymore. This was about a past that had finally returned to collect its debt. And Marcus was about to learn something terrifying, because Daniel hadn't come back for the money. He came back for Marcus. Marcus stared at Elaine like she had just spoken a language he didn't understand. Daniel called you? Elaine nodded calmly. Yes. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. Why would he call you? Elaine answered without hesitation. Because he couldn't reach you. The officer immediately looked at Marcus. Did Daniel try contacting you recently? Marcus hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any answer could. Finally, he sighed. He left a voicemail last week. Elaine closed her eyes briefly. You didn't mention that. Marcus ran a hand through his hair. I didn't think it mattered. Now let's pause for a second. Have you ever noticed how often people say, I didn't think it mattered, right before something turns out to matter a whole lot? The officer spoke carefully. What did the voicemail say? Marcus looked down at the table. He said we needed to talk. About what? Marcus shrugged slightly. He didn't say. But Elaine knew better, because when someone disappears for over a decade and suddenly calls, they rarely want to talk about the weather. The officer tapped his pen on the table. And Vanessa contacted Elaine 5 days ago, asking to talk about Marcus. Marcus felt the pieces slowly sliding together in a way he didn't like. Vanessa had been researching his past. Daniel had suddenly reappeared, and Vanessa had shown up at Elaine's house the day she disappeared. The officer leaned forward again. Mr. Langford, did Vanessa know about Daniel? Marcus shook his head. No, I never told her. Elaine raised an eyebrow slightly. Are you sure about that? Marcus frowned. What do you mean? Elaine walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up her phone. Because when Daniel called me, he said something interesting. The officer waited. Elaine read from her phone. He said, Tell Marcus the woman asking questions needs to stop digging. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The woman asking questions, the officer repeated. Vanessa, Elaine said quietly. The room went silent again, because that sentence changed everything. Vanessa hadn't just been curious, she had been digging into something Daniel didn't want uncovered. And that meant Vanessa's disappearance might not be random at all. The officer stood up again. Mr. Langford, I need to ask you something directly. Marcus nodded slowly. Did Daniel ever threaten you? Marcus thought for a moment. Not exactly. The officer narrowed his eyes slightly. What does that mean? Marcus sighed. After the company collapsed, Daniel believed I betrayed him. Elaine spoke quietly. Because you did. Marcus looked at her sharply. That's not fair. But Elaine didn't argue, because the truth didn't need defending. The officer asked the next question. What happened to the $2 million? Marcus rubbed his temples again. It was lost in bad investments. Elaine shook her head slowly. No, it wasn't. Marcus turned toward her. What are you talking about? Elaine walked over to the bookshelf near the living room. She pulled out an old folder Marcus hadn't seen in years. The officer watched closely. Elaine placed the folder on the table. Inside were bank statements, wire transfers, investment reports. The officer flipped through the papers carefully. Then he looked up. Mr. Langford, these records show something very different. Marcus felt his chest tighten again. What do you mean? The officer pointed to a line on one of the documents. The money wasn't lost. Marcus stared at the paper. The officer continued, It was moved. Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. Moved where? The officer looked him directly in the eye. Into an account that only you had access to. The room suddenly felt smaller, because in one moment, Marcus realized something horrifying. Vanessa hadn't just discovered Daniel, Vanessa had discovered the money. And if Daniel believed Marcus stole it and Vanessa knew the truth, then her disappearance suddenly had a very dangerous explanation, because someone might have wanted Vanessa to stop asking questions. But the most terrifying part was this. The last person Vanessa went to see, before she disappeared, was the one person who had known Marcus the longest, Elaine. And suddenly, Marcus had to face a question he never imagined asking. What if the person who knew the truth all along was sitting right across the table from him? Marcus looked at Elaine like he was seeing her for the first time. Are you saying you knew about this? Elaine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly closed the folder and rested her hands on the table. The officer watched both of them carefully, because in situations like this, the truth usually hides in the silence between people. Finally, Elaine spoke. I didn't know everything, she said, but I knew enough. Marcus shook his head. Enough about what? Elaine's voice stayed calm. Enough to know that the business didn't collapse the way you told everyone it did. Marcus stood up from the table. That's ridiculous. But his voice lacked confidence, and everyone in the room could hear it. The officer remained seated. Mrs. Langford, when did you first suspect something? Elaine thought for a moment. The night Daniel came to the house. Marcus froze. You said you hadn't seen him. Elaine looked at him evenly. You said that. The officer leaned forward. Daniel came here? Elaine nodded. 12 years ago, the night the company fell apart. Marcus looked like he wanted to interrupt, but didn't, because deep down he knew she was telling the truth. Elaine continued. He was angry, really angry. The officer asked quietly. What did he say? Elaine answered slowly. He said Marcus took the money. Marcus slammed his hand lightly on the table. That's not what happened. But Elaine didn't raise her voice. Then why did you move it into a private account? Marcus didn't answer. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how people will argue loudly about something until someone asks the one question they can't answer? That's exactly what happened to Marcus, because for the first time since this conversation started, he had no response. The officer looked at him carefully. "Mr. Langford, why was the money moved?" Marcus finally sat down again. "I panicked." The officer waited. "The investments were failing," Marcus said. "I thought if I moved the money temporarily, I could fix things before anyone noticed." Elaine shook her head slightly. "But you didn't fix it." Marcus looked at the floor. "No." The officer asked the next obvious question. "What happened to the money after that?" Marcus spoke quietly. "I used some of it to cover debts." Elaine finished the sentence. "And the rest disappeared." Marcus didn't deny it. The officer wrote a few more notes. "So Daniel believed you stole $2 million. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes. And now Vanessa discovered those records." Marcus closed his eyes. "Apparently." But something still didn't add up, because if Vanessa found the truth about the money, why would she come to Elaine instead of the police? Elaine answered that question before anyone asked it. She wanted confirmation. The officer looked up. Confirmation of what? Elaine folded her hands again. That Marcus wasn't lying to her the way he lied to Daniel. Marcus looked hurt. Elaine. But she continued anyway. "She told me in the email that she felt something about Marcus didn't add up." The officer nodded slowly. "So Vanessa came here looking for the truth." "Yes," Elaine said. "And according to the neighbor, she waited on your porch." Elaine nodded again. "But I wasn't home." Marcus rubbed his face. "And then she left with some guy." The officer tapped his notebook. "Which brings us back to the real question. Who was the man Vanessa left with?" Elaine spoke quietly. "I think I know." Marcus looked up again. "Who?" Elaine met his eyes. "Daniel." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You're certain?" Elaine nodded slowly. "When Daniel called 3 days ago, he said something else." The officer waited. "He said, 'I finally found the woman who knows where the money went.'" Marcus's stomach dropped, because Vanessa didn't know where the money went, but Daniel clearly believed she did. And if Daniel had taken Vanessa to force answers out of her, then Marcus suddenly realized something terrifying. Daniel wasn't looking for Vanessa. Daniel was looking for him. But what Marcus didn't know yet was that Daniel had already tried to reach him again. And the next message Daniel left wasn't a voicemail, it was a warning. And the place Daniel chose for their meeting was somewhere Marcus never expected to return. The place where this entire story began. The old investment office. Marcus hadn't thought about the old office in years. In fact, he had gone out of his way to forget it. The building sat on the edge of downtown, an aging brick structure with dusty windows and a faded sign that still carried the name of the company Marcus and Daniel once believed would make them rich, Langford and Pierce Investments. Back then, Marcus thought that name meant success. Now it felt more like a ghost. The officer closed his notebook and stood up. "Mr. Langford, we need to see that office." Marcus frowned. "It's been empty for years." "Maybe," the officer replied. "But if Daniel contacted you recently, it could still be important." Marcus nodded reluctantly. Within 30 minutes, the three of them were driving across town. And the closer Marcus got to that building, the more memories started creeping back. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever returned to a place that reminds you of the worst mistake you ever made? Because that's exactly what this felt like. The parking lot was nearly empty when they arrived, just a few cracked lines on the pavement and weeds growing through the concrete. Marcus stepped out of the car slowly. The sign above the building was still there, faded, crooked, but still readable. He hadn't seen that name in over a decade, and suddenly, the past didn't feel so far away anymore. The officer walked toward the entrance. Is it locked? Marcus pulled a small key ring from his pocket. He stared at one particular key for a moment. I guess we'll find out. The door creaked loudly as it opened. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old paper. The reception desk was still there, the same one where Marcus used to greet investors with confident smiles and promises of big returns. Promises he never managed to keep. Elaine walked in behind them quietly, looking around. So this is where it all started. Marcus didn't respond, because she was right. This was the place where everything began falling apart. The officer switched on a flashlight. Let's look around. They moved slowly through the hallway. Empty offices, broken chairs, stacks of old paperwork left behind like forgotten memories. Marcus stopped outside one particular door, his old office. He pushed it open. The room looked frozen in time. An old desk, a filing cabinet, and the same leather chair Marcus used to sit in while making deals that seemed brilliant at the time. But something on the desk caught the officer's attention. An envelope. Fresh, not dusty like everything else. The officer picked it up carefully. It had one word written on the front. Marcus. Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken. That wasn't here before. The officer opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He read it silently for a moment. Then his expression changed. "What does it say?" Marcus asked. The officer handed him the paper. Marcus read the message out loud. "You finally came back." His voice tightened slightly. Then he continued reading. "If you want to see Vanessa again, come alone." Marcus stopped. The officer looked at him carefully. "Keep reading." Marcus swallowed and finished the message. "Midnight, same place you betrayed me. Daniel." The room felt colder. Elaine spoke quietly. "Marcus, don't go." But Marcus knew something she didn't. Daniel believed Vanessa had answers, which meant Vanessa might still be alive. The officer folded his arms. "This could be a trap." Marcus nodded. "I know. But some mistakes follow you forever, and some consequences can't be avoided." Marcus looked at the clock on the wall. It was already past 8. Midnight was only a few hours away. And somewhere out there, Daniel was waiting. But what Marcus didn't realize yet was that Daniel wasn't the only person planning to show up that night, because someone else had been watching this entire situation unfold. Someone who knew exactly what happened to the missing money. Someone who had stayed silent for years. And when midnight arrived, that person was finally going to speak. And the truth they carried would change everything Marcus thought he understood about Vanessa's disappearance. The hours leading up to midnight felt longer than they should have. Marcus sat in his car across the street from the old office building, staring at the cracked windows like they might suddenly start talking. The officer had insisted on a plan. "You won't actually be alone," he told Marcus earlier that evening. "We'll stay nearby." But Daniel's note had been clear. Come alone. And people like Daniel, people who carry grudges for over a decade, usually mean exactly what they say. Marcus checked the time again. 11:42 p.m. 18 minutes to go. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever waited for something you know might end badly, but you go anyway because the alternative feels worse? That's exactly where Marcus was sitting. Because if Vanessa was truly with Daniel, then walking away wasn't an option. Across town, Elaine sat in her living room watching the clock. She had tried to tell Marcus not to go, but deep down she knew something about Marcus that hadn't changed in 30 years. When guilt starts knocking at his door, Marcus always answers. Meanwhile, the police officer parked 2 streets away with his radio on low volume. Backup units were already nearby, quiet, watching, waiting. Because if Daniel really had Vanessa, tonight could end in one of 2 ways: answers or disaster. Back at the office building, Marcus finally stepped out of the car. 11:58 p.m. The night air felt colder than usual, or maybe that was just nerves. He walked toward the entrance slowly, the echo of his footsteps bouncing off the empty parking lot. The door creaked open again. Inside, the same dusty silence waited for him. Marcus stepped into the hallway. "Daniel?" he called out. No response. The beam of a flashlight suddenly appeared from the far end of the hall. Then a voice. Older, rougher, but unmistakable. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come." Marcus's chest tightened. Daniel. A man stepped into the light. 12 years had changed him. More great hair, more lines in his face, but the anger in his eyes looked exactly the same. Daniel studied Marcus for a moment. "You look good," he said sarcastically. Marcus ignored the comment. "Where's Vanessa?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Straight to business." Marcus took a step forward. "Is she alive?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly into Marcus's old office. Marcus followed, and that's when he saw something that stopped him cold. Someone sitting in the chair. Hands tied, a strip of cloth around her wrists, but very much alive. Vanessa! Marcus rushed forward. "Vanessa!" Daniel held up a hand. "Easy." Vanessa looked tired, scared, but unharmed. "Marcus," she said softly. Marcus turned back to Daniel. "What do you want?" Daniel laughed quietly. "You really have to ask?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "The money." Daniel nodded. "Finally." Marcus shook his head. "I told you years ago, it's gone." Daniel's expression darkened. "No, it isn't." Marcus frowned. "What are you talking about?" Daniel stepped closer. "Vanessa found it." Marcus blinked. "That's impossible." Vanessa spoke from the chair. "It's not." Both men turned toward her. She looked directly at Marcus. "The money isn't gone, Marcus." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Then where is it?" Vanessa's answer came quietly. "Somewhere you never expected anyone to look." Daniel smiled slightly. "Go ahead," he said to her. "Tell him." Vanessa took a breath. "The money was never stolen." Marcus shook his head. "That's ridiculous." But Vanessa's next sentence froze the room. "Elaine moved it." Marcus stared at her. "What?" Daniel crossed his arms. "That's right." Marcus looked from Daniel to Vanessa, completely confused. "You're saying Elaine stole the money?" Vanessa shook her head slowly. "No." Then she said something even more shocking. "She protected it." Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. "From me?" Vanessa nodded. "Yes." Because the truth Marcus had spent 12 years avoiding was about to come crashing down all at once. And the biggest twist in this entire story was that the woman Marcus believed he had outsmarted all those years ago had actually been the one protecting him from a mistake that could have destroyed his life. But Marcus was about to discover something else, too. Elaine hadn't just protected the money. She had protected him. And now, that secret was finally coming to light. Marcus felt like the floor beneath him had shifted. "Elaine moved the money?" he repeated slowly. Vanessa nodded from the chair, her voice steady despite the ropes around her wrists. "Yes." Marcus looked at Daniel. Daniel wasn't smiling anymore. He looked confused, because for 12 years, Daniel believed one thing with absolute certainty. Marcus had stolen the money. But if Elaine moved it, then that story wasn't as simple as it once seemed. Marcus shook his head. That doesn't make any sense. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. It does if you understand what really happened the night the company collapsed. Marcus felt a chill creep up his spine. Then explain it. Vanessa took a slow breath. The bank transfer records show something interesting, she said. The money left the investment account late at night. Marcus frowned. So? So, the transfer happened after Daniel confronted you. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Marcus said nothing. Vanessa continued. And the account it went to was opened the very next morning. Marcus crossed his arms. What's your point? Vanessa looked directly at him. The account wasn't opened in your name. Marcus blinked. What? Daniel leaned closer. Then whose name was it under? Vanessa answered quietly. Elaine's. The room fell silent again. Marcus looked like someone had just told him gravity stopped working. That's impossible. Vanessa shook her head. It's not. Daniel turned toward Marcus slowly. You told me you moved the money. Marcus looked just as confused as he did. I thought I did. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. You started the transfer. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? Vanessa explained. The first transaction moved the money into a temporary holding account. Marcus nodded slowly. That's right. But before you could move it again, Vanessa continued, someone else accessed the account. Marcus felt the realization begin forming in his mind. No. Vanessa nodded. Yes. Daniel's voice was low. Elaine finished the transfer. Marcus stepped back slightly. That's not possible. Elaine didn't even know the login information. Vanessa looked at him carefully. She didn't need it. Marcus frowned. What are you talking about? Vanessa said something that made the entire puzzle suddenly start fitting together. She had your laptop. Marcus froze, because suddenly a memory surfaced. 12 years ago, the night everything fell apart. Marcus had stormed out of the house after Daniel accused him of stealing the money. His laptop had been sitting on the kitchen table, still logged into the company account, still open, still connected. Marcus slowly looked up. You're saying Elaine saw everything? Vanessa nodded. Yes. Daniel's voice grew tense. So Elaine moved the money instead of Marcus. Vanessa nodded again. That's right. Marcus felt a strange mixture of shock and disbelief. But why? Vanessa answered softly. To protect you. Marcus laughed under his breath. That doesn't make any sense. Vanessa looked at him carefully. Marcus, if the money had stayed in your control, investigators would have found it. Marcus didn't respond, because that part was true. Vanessa continued. Moving the money into Elaine's name separated it from the company records. Daniel folded his arms. So the money never disappeared. Vanessa nodded. It was hidden, Marcus whispered. By my wife. Vanessa gave him a sad look. Your wife knew the lawsuits were coming. Marcus stared at the floor. She was trying to keep you out of prison. The words hung in the air like a heavy truth no one could ignore. Daniel looked stunned. Marcus looked something else. Something closer to regret. Because for 12 years, Marcus believed he had outsmarted everyone. But the truth was far more uncomfortable. He hadn't protected himself at all. The person who protected him was the woman he eventually walked away from. But there was still one question Marcus needed answered, and it was the one question that suddenly mattered more than the money. Marcus looked at Vanessa. If Elaine moved the money, then where is it now? Vanessa held his gaze. That's the problem. Marcus frowned. What problem? Vanessa answered quietly. Elaine is the only one who knows. Daniel slowly turned toward Marcus again, and this time his anger wasn't aimed at the past, it was aimed at the present, because suddenly Daniel understood something Marcus was only beginning to realize. If Elaine had been protecting Marcus all along, then the person holding the final truth in this story was the one person Marcus had already lost. For a long moment, nobody in the room spoke. Dust floated through the beam of the flashlight like tiny drifting secrets. Marcus stood there staring at the floor, trying to process what Vanessa had just said. Elaine moved the money. Elaine protected him. And somehow, he'd spent the last year believing she was the person he needed to escape. Marcus exhaled slowly. So all this time, he said quietly, Elaine knew where the money was. Vanessa nodded. Yes. Daniel ran a hand across his face, clearly trying to hold back 12 years of anger. You mean to tell me, he said slowly, I've been chasing the wrong man this whole time? Vanessa shook her head. No, Marcus started it. Marcus didn't argue, because that part was true. Vanessa continued. Elaine didn't create the problem. She tried to contain it. Daniel turned toward Marcus. Then why didn't she ever come forward? Vanessa answered before Marcus could. Because if she did, Marcus would have gone to prison. The room fell quiet again. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever realized someone protected you, even when you didn't deserve it? That's the kind of realization that doesn't just sit in your mind. It lands somewhere deeper. Marcus slowly sat down in the old chair behind his desk, the same chair where he once believed he controlled everything, but now it felt different, smaller. You said Elaine moved the money, Marcus said. Yes, but how did you figure that out? Vanessa gave a tired smile. That's what I do for a living. Daniel crossed his arms. Explain. Vanessa continued. I was analyzing old financial records for Marcus's real estate company a few months ago. Marcus looked up. And I noticed something strange, Vanessa said. The numbers didn't line up with the story Marcus told me. Marcus sighed. Of course they didn't. Vanessa continued. The $2 million didn't disappear the way everyone believed. Daniel leaned closer. So what happened? Vanessa explained carefully. The transfer trail stopped, but the digital timestamp showed another login after Marcus logged out. Marcus frowned. That's impossible. Vanessa shook her head. It would have been impossible if the login didn't come from Marcus's home computer. Marcus's stomach dropped. The laptop. The one he left open that night. Vanessa continued. Once I realized that, I started looking at property records. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Property records? Yes, said Vanessa, because if someone suddenly had access to $2 million, it would show up somewhere eventually. Marcus whispered, and it did. Vanessa nodded. Yes. Daniel leaned forward. Where? Vanessa paused. Now the room felt tense again, because the answer to that question had started this entire chain of events. Vanessa finally spoke. There's a trust. Marcus frowned. A trust? Yes. Daniel's voice grew sharp. Whose name? Vanessa looked directly at Marcus. Elaine's. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. But that doesn't mean she kept it. Vanessa nodded slowly. You're right. Marcus leaned forward. Then where is it? Vanessa answered quietly. The trust has one rule. Daniel narrowed his eyes. What rule? Vanessa spoke slowly. The money can't be touched unless both partners from the original company agree. Daniel blinked. Both partners? Marcus looked confused. That doesn't make sense. Vanessa held his gaze. The trust lists 2 required signatures. Marcus felt something strange in his chest. Who? Vanessa answered. You and Daniel. Daniel let out a short laugh. So the money has been sitting there for 12 years. Marcus finished the sentence softly. Waiting for us. Vanessa nodded. Yes. The room felt heavier now, because suddenly the money wasn't the problem anymore. The problem was something much harder to fix. Trust. Daniel looked at Marcus again. You betrayed me once. Marcus nodded slowly. I know. Daniel glanced at Vanessa, then back at Marcus. But now we have a different problem. Marcus frowned. What? Daniel said something that shifted the entire conversation. If Elaine controls the trust... Marcus waited. Daniel finished the thought. Then why didn't she ever tell you? Marcus didn't have an answer, but deep down he was starting to suspect something painful, because maybe Elaine hadn't been hiding the truth from Daniel. Maybe she had been hiding it from Marcus himself. And when Marcus finally understood why, it would force him to confront the one thing he'd spent years avoiding, the real reason Elaine protected him in the first place. The room felt quieter than before, not the tense kind of silence, the reflective kind, the kind that happens when the truth finally settles in. Marcus sat there staring at the old desk, his mind drifting back 12 years, then back even further, back to the kitchen table where Elaine used to sit every morning with a cup of coffee, back to the small things he stopped noticing, the way she always remembered to lock the door at night, the way she kept their family together when business started falling apart, the way she used to tell him one simple thing whenever he made a bad decision. Marcus, think before it's too late. He hadn't listened then, and now here he was, 12 years later, still learning that same lesson. Daniel broke the silence first. So the money is sitting in a trust, waiting for both of us to sign. Vanessa nodded. Yes. Daniel looked at Marcus. And the woman who created that trust is the one you left? Marcus didn't respond, because hearing it out loud made it sound worse than it already felt. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever realized that the person you walked away from was the same person quietly protecting you the whole time? That kind of realization doesn't feel like victory. It feels like regret. Heavy regret. Marcus finally stood up. What time is it? Daniel checked his watch. 12:27. Marcus looked toward Vanessa. We need to untie her. Daniel hesitated. For 12 years, Daniel had imagined this moment differently. In his mind, it ended with anger, maybe revenge, but the truth had changed something. Because suddenly, the enemy he believed he was chasing wasn't the real story at all. Daniel sighed and pulled a small knife from his pocket. He cut the rope around Vanessa's wrists. There, he said. Vanessa slowly stood up, rubbing her hands. Thank you. Daniel shrugged. Don't thank me. I still kidnapped you. Vanessa gave a tired half-smile. Well, at least you didn't hurt me. Daniel looked at Marcus. I was never going to hurt her. Marcus nodded slowly. I know. Outside the building, the police were still waiting, watching, listening. But inside that old office, something unexpected had already happened. The truth had done what anger couldn't. It had ended the fight. Daniel leaned against the desk. So what happens now? Marcus looked down at the dusty floor again. For years, he believed the money was the biggest mistake he had ever made. But standing there now, he realized something else entirely. The money wasn't the mistake. Leaving Elaine was. Marcus exhaled slowly. I need to talk to her. Vanessa nodded. You probably should. Daniel added quietly. You definitely should. Marcus walked toward the doorway, then stopped, because another realization suddenly hit him, something Vanessa had said earlier. Elaine created the trust. Elaine protected the money. Elaine protected him for 12 years, and yet she never once came back asking for recognition, never demanded credit, never exposed him. Marcus looked back at Vanessa. Why didn't she ever tell me? Vanessa gave him a sad look. I think you already know the answer. Marcus frowned. No, I don't. Vanessa spoke softly. Because she wasn't protecting the money, Marcus. Marcus waited. Vanessa finished the sentence. She was protecting you from yourself. The words settled in slowly, because sometimes the hardest truth isn't the one about money or betrayal or mistakes. Sometimes the hardest truth is realizing the one person who loved you enough to protect you is the same person you chose to walk away from. And Marcus was about to face something even harder, because when he finally stood in front of Elaine again, he would have to explain why the man she protected for 12 years was the same man who left her behind. The drive to Maple Street felt longer than it ever had before. Marcus had driven that road thousands of times over the years, coming home from work, picking up groceries, driving the kids to school when they were younger. Back then, it had just been a road. Now it felt like a path back to a life he had broken with his own hands. The street was quiet when he arrived. Most of the houses were dark, but Elaine's porch light was still on, just like it had been for decades. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some people leave the light on even after someone walks out? Marcus stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before walking up the steps. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what he was going to say. He knocked. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened. Elaine stood there in the soft glow of the hallway light. She looked the same as she always had. Calm, steady. The kind of presence that once made Marcus feel like everything in life was under control. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Elaine broke the silence. You found out. Marcus nodded slowly. Yes. She stepped aside and let him come in. The house looked exactly the way he remembered. The same couch, the same clock above the fireplace, still ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Marcus turned toward her. Why didn't you tell me? Elaine looked at him quietly. Would it have changed anything? Marcus didn't answer, because deep down, he knew the truth. Back then, he wouldn't have listened. Elaine continued. That night, when Daniel came to the house, you were scared. Marcus lowered his eyes. I remember. You were angry, too, she said. Angry enough to make another mistake. Marcus looked back up. So you moved the money? Elaine nodded. Yes. Marcus struggled to understand it. You could have exposed me. Yes. You could have turned me in. Yes. Marcus's voice softened. But you didn't. Elaine looked toward the window for a moment before answering. Because I knew something you didn't. Marcus frowned. What? Elaine met his eyes again. That you were going to regret it. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. You waited 12 years? Elaine gave a small smile. Sometimes people need time to learn their own lessons. Marcus looked around the house again. The life he once called ordinary. The life he walked away from because he thought something else would make him happier. He finally spoke the words that had been sitting in his mind all night. I made a mistake. Elaine didn't argue. She simply nodded. Yes. Now, let's pause for a moment. Because this is the part of the story people don't like to admit. Sometimes apologies come too late. Marcus looked at her. I left the one person who was protecting me the whole time. Elaine didn't respond. Instead, she walked over to the small table near the window and picked up an envelope. She handed it to him. "What's this?" Marcus asked. "The trust documents," she said. Marcus opened the envelope slowly. Inside were the papers Vanessa had mentioned. The money, still there, untouched, waiting. Marcus looked up. "You're giving it back?" Elaine nodded. "It was never mine." Marcus hesitated. "And us?" Elaine paused for a moment before answering. Somewhere in the house, the old clock ticked again. Then she said something simple, something honest, something that felt like the final lesson of the entire story. "Marcus, some things you protect." She looked at him gently. "And some things you let go." Marcus stood there quietly, holding the envelope. Because for the first time in a long time, he finally understood the difference. And sometimes, the hardest lessons in life aren't about money. They're about realizing the value of the person who stood beside you for decades, only after you've already walked away. And that's the thing about quiet love. You don't always notice it when it's there, but you feel its absence for the rest of your life.
Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. If this story touched your heart, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories about resilience, dignity, and quiet justice. Because some lessons don't come with applause, they come with peace.